Alrighty, everybody. Welcome. And welcome to not only our first panel discussion for PELS, but also our first co-hosted event with the Photovoltaic Society. So this is yet another first. So glad to have everyone be a part of here. My name is Brian Zonstecker, and I'm the chair of the Power Electronics Society. And you are here tonight. Uh-oh. Oh, wait. Oh, that's because I put these stupid animations in here. Well, first of all, you are also beholden to the now worldwide leading, the best chapter in both the region, the section, Santa Clara Valley, the region, which is Region 6, which is pretty much all the western U.S., Utah, Montana on west, and the world. We get the best chapter for PELS, which this is an unprecedented feat, especially doing this essentially a year out of after starting from a place of dormancy. So we're very proud of what we achieved, and you guys are a big part of that. So we thank you for that. There we go. Okay, enough bragging. This is why you're here tonight. If this is a surprise to you, then you're probably in the wrong spot. But we have this great panel discussion tonight with three excellent panelists providing different perspectives. And don't you guys think that this is going to be one of these normal talks where you get to sit back and just absorb it? This is meant to be an open discussion, which is why we've reserved the majority of tonight's 90 minutes for an open discussion with the panelists. So you guys get all your hot questions, and if you're thinking about being shy, well, don't, and we'll help call you out and make sure we drag you into it gleefully kicking and screaming. Thank you very much to our venue sponsor, TI, who provides this for us, and Jeff Nillis. We should give them a hand because they provide this. It's not only do they provide it to us free of charge, but it's better than that. They provide us professional AV services, and Bob and Christian in the back. Thanks, guys. We really wouldn't be able to do a lot of what we do without that type of support. We certainly want to thank our co-sponsor tonight, the PV Society, and this is their info. And I'd like to also introduce, call up David McDougall, who's the chair of that group, to give a quick blurb on that. You also have to tell me too, Nate, I'm always wondering, in the logo there, that's supposed to be the Earth, or is there some other type of crystalline structure? Or?
That was put together before I became the chapter chair. I hope we didn't spend a lot of money on that either. Just very quickly, I'm the chapter chair for the Photovoltaic Society around here. We're not the best chapter in the world, unfortunately, but we're trying to be. Very quickly, I just want to invite people here. We're having a meeting in December, showcase startup. We're going to have 4 or 5, let's say, startups, maybe even pre-angel funding kind of companies who have been working with some incubators in the area, coming to share their new ideas and their technologies, and maybe even share why they still think there's hope to be a startup in photovoltaics in this area. It's littered with a lot of carnage, but they're still going at it, and I'm happy to let them share their story. So aside from that, thanks for coming, and I'm going to turn it back over to Brian.
All right, thank you very much, Dave. And just to highlight what Dave has here, also be emphasizing this, of course, please silence your phones out of respect for our speakers. Take a moment to do that now if you're not sure, and especially you speakers, that just, talk about the pot calling the kettle black there. And then also, note point about please do not take photos. We are capturing this, and the presenters have agreed to make materials available, and that will be on the website and all that after. So aside from being disruptive, we also don't want to be disrespectful to them and take photos of their materials. So I'll appreciate if we can respect that as well. Just a quick moment to recognize the PELS group of officers and volunteers that make up the PELS executive committee. A lot of folks put a lot of work in. For those that are on here in the room, please stand up so you can be recognized. And that includes Kevin. He was already standing, our AV man in the back. But thank you very much. These are the folks, NMP, who's already standing too. So folks that really make it happen. This is a feature, something we've been doing new recently called Power Sources, where we take a few minutes to provide you some kind of, golden nugget or gem or one of those things you learn through osmosis after 20 years that you wish someone had told you early on. But we are going to skip that tonight for the sake of time. So that was maybe the best golden nugget you can get. Are you a senior member of the IEEE? If not, that's something that we can help you fix. The most cumbersome main requirements in terms of just being an IEEE member for 10 years, having significant contributions to the industry, and significant doesn't mean a 40-page CV and all these prestigious. It means making doing things that have helped the industry, your colleagues, your companies, and all that. So those requirements are not that extensive, but the tough part is getting support from existing members to sponsor you. You need 3 for your application, even if you self-nominate in your application, and we can help you with that too. So if you're interested in this, don't expect you to read it all now. If you're interested in senior membership, it's something you should do. Looks good. You get a plaque, you send a letter to your boss, lots of kudos, and everything that money can't buy. We have a website, there it is. Go check it out. You probably did if you're here. It's an educational initiative, STEM initiative, Encore. They're a group that hooks up professionals like yourselves with students. You don't have to have teaching experience or credentials. It's just the idea of being able to take advantage of the knowledge and experience you have, and maybe just on the weekend if you ever wanted to teach a class to elementary or high school students, and potentially as a path to actually being in a professional teaching. This is the way to do it. The eGrid is certainly one of the best resources that we have in IEEE Santa Clara Valley for the whole section, really for the whole Bay. This is a one-stop shop. You don't have to be an IEEE member. It doesn't cost anything. All you have to do is go there, throw in your email once, and from now to the end of time, you will get twice a month dropped right in your inbox. You'll get a nice list of all the events going on through all the societies and everything. So instead of being on 50 lists, it's like being on one for free. It's one of the best resources that there is. We mentioned that, so thank you all for coming, and so there'll be a lot more good stuff coming up. So with that being said, I would like to introduce our panelists.
I just wanted to mention one thing.
Oh, you're not charging now, are you? Take back all the nice things I said.
I think Brian said a lot of things, but I wanted to mention that we have our IEEE elections coming up.
Thank you. I knew I forgot something. Keep me honest.
And so we're looking for officers. As you probably are aware, you're not supposed to keep in the same position for more than 3 years for IEEE. And I think most of us have been in it, will be for like almost 2 years now. And so we like to rotate through positions, and it's not that complicated to start out as a member at large or something like that. You can coast a little bit, though it'd be helpful if you're a member at large to help like run one of our conferences or something like that, and kind of step in and get to know the members. So, but we are looking for members, and come up and send it in IEEE or talk to Brian or myself or any of the other people who stood up. Thank you.
That's right. Thank you, Jeff, for reminding me of that, because that's the one slide I left out. There's 4 officer positions, right? Chair, vice chair, secretary, treasurer. And then just volunteering. You don't have to run for anything, sign up for anything, but just be part of the team that makes this happen. So even if you're thinking about it, you're not sure what the commitment is, what it means, how much or little, just come talk to us, and we'll let you know. But the call for nominations is open now. It's open through next Friday. So please talk to us or email one of us if you're even thinking about it. Thank you, Jeff, again, for keeping me honest there. Okay, now I'd like to introduce our 3 panelists. And the way it's going to work is we're going to have the 3 panelists come up. They're going to each give kind of an intro overview of their area and contribution to this topic. And then after that, we're just going to open it up and save the majority of the remainder of, should be about an hour, to just have an open discussion about this. So we'll introduce them and have them come up one at a time here. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Alok Gupta. Alok is currently an independent consultant focused on energy storage and clean tech and smart grid spaces. Previously, he was the Senior Director of Market Development and Policy at Emergy Power Systems, a developer of turnkey energy storage solutions. Prior to Emergy, he was a regulator at the California Public Utilities Commission and focused on developing regulatory policies related to energy storage, DSM, DER, smart grid, AMI, and other areas. Please help join me in welcoming Alok. Man, who's running this thing? And our second panelist is Andy Skamanik. Dr. Andy Skamanik is a successful Silicon Valley tech entrepreneur. He is currently CEO and founder of Solar Vision Company, which is a technology business development company focused on alternative energy with a core team of technologists. He's a global expert on microgrids, has participated as part of a team installing greater than 1 megawatt of microgrids in developing countries. Please join me in welcoming Andy. And then just to introduce our third panelist is Ian Petrie. Ian Petrie is he works for the FAA in the Office of Hazardous Material Safety as a hazardous material safety inspector. He's currently working for AXH-200, the Standards and Stakeholders Division, and his role is to influence the development of safety policies and international standards that complement U.S. regulations and or support U.S. aviation programs and initiatives. All right, join me in welcoming Ian. And now I'll turn it over to Andy to start running this show, and I'm just here to try and keep you guys honest.
Oh, don't work too hard on that. I think there was somebody gave me a quote. I wish I could remember it, but it was something to the effect of, there's honest people and then there's battery salesmen. Something like that. And that kind of captures the spirit of it, but I'm going to have to track that down. You know, so now you know. And that was told to me by a battery salesman. So that's, you know, I'll have to call him up and find out. Okay, so anyway, I just want to set the stage a little bit. My background is actually, I'm a physicist that also studied engineering. There won't be any equations in this talk, although I was very tempted because I've got the right audience for it. Do we have this one off? Yeah, good, okay. But there are some results from equations, and there are some graphs. So at least I still have a little bit of my background that'll come through. But I want to, as I say, set the stage a little bit for kind of an overview and the discussions that follow, and introduce you to what I call the brave new world, or in some ways the new brave new world. Let's see, what do I have here? No, that's not right. I want to go forward. Okay. Just very briefly, who we are at Solar Vision. We're a core group of technologists. We each bring some slightly different angles to it. We do technical advising and technical market assessment, and in a sense what we look at is how do you map a technology to a market? How do you establish a path to commercialization? And obviously that's very important for startups, but it's equally important in large companies that have potential ideas. And what are they going to do with those ideas? Are they worth pursuing? Are they worth putting money into it? Are they worth putting their best scientists or maybe their second, strings on it? But in any event, the idea is you have to kind of assess these and establish what the value is in a scientific sense and in a market sense. So we do things along those lines. The main themes that I'm going to touch on, and I think we want to keep in mind here, with regards to batteries, is that there are enormous challenges, but equally enormous opportunities. And I'm sure you all probably have a feel for that by now, what these opportunities are. And I'm going to actually put some numbers to it. Why are batteries important? One of the simplest reasons, and coming from let's say a solar background, which I've been in for a while, is the ability to get power on demand. So instant power, getting it when you want it, where you want it, how you want it. We're not yet there because, as I like to put it, batteries are still a chemistry experiment. So some of them are chemistry experiments that have been working for a good while, but other ones are still, they deserve to stay in the lab, in the fab, and not yet out on the street. Another concept that I think is worth touching on is that of personal power, which is, in a sense, the Uberization of power. And that's meant in both the literal sense that Uber is everywhere, and also the company Uber in that it's sort of a peer-to-peer type use of energy. There's a lot of examples of that developing in microgrids, which we won't have time for. And I'll just leave you with a thought here that, in a sense, the grid that we're used to really is just a giant battery in some regards, either it being nuclear, coal, or gas. I mean, you have a chemical reaction that's effectively causing heat. So what we're looking at is that we're looking at small portable grids that we call batteries. And that's just another perspective on it. This is a slide from a report that we've put together on the battery space and the costs and where things are headed. What I want to show here, if there's a pointer, no, but okay, in the upper right side, the idea here is just to see the extent of the demands and the space for batteries and for storage. In this particular case, it's all types of storage. But you see that you have needs from second to minute up to months and longer, and power requirements of maybe even just kilowatts up to hundreds of megawatts. And I don't want to walk you through this, but batteries occupy sort of a central part here in terms of power requirements, sub 10 megawatts and days down to the lower corner. And then in the blue are various applications that the utilities would use in that space. So you see there's a lot of dimension to it. Now, I mentioned the implementation of technology. So I wanted to capture here some of the challenges of what that looks like in the battery space. And I've tried to give you a few numbers just to give you a feeling. So there's no limit to the ideas, but let's say there's sort of officially about 1,000 research ideas. And if you want a way to get a number behind it, Google thin film batteries, and you'll get 22,000 responses, and it takes about a third of a second. And if you know what that means when you do a Google search, a third of a second is like an eon. But the point here is that there are just tons, lots of activities in terms of innovative concepts and ideas and approaches. Things like, I mean, when you're talking batteries, you're talking about charge separation, but there's ideas like using the sweat on your body as a battery. I kid you not. Things like that, and I won't even go on from there because there are just so many exotic ones. But then if you look at what are, say, the funded opportunities, you're down to maybe 100. Now, it turns out that in the last couple decades, only 36 of these startups have gotten more than $500,000 in funding. So already you're starting to funnel this down to, you know, what really is deserving of energy or money. Of those, 2 gave returns that were greater than the monies put into them. So you see here, the ideas to money success rate is less than is about 0.1%. Now, if you were to have guessed it, you probably wouldn't have, you know, been knowing where. It seems like it's a lot more, but there you go. Is that 0? No. But it's not too far from it. That's not meant to discourage you because, in a sense, there is a lot of opportunity, and we're going to get to in a second just how big that opportunity is. But what I want to say here is that in a real way, the improvements are incremental and steady. So it's not big, dramatic steps like an iPhone. And that's true not just in batteries, but also in other materials areas like solar, especially because of the nature of this market. You can't have quantum steps, but you can have steps that take you up to a quanta step. So we may get to that. Part of that is going back to the basics, and I should put engineering here, physics and chemistry. So the challenges for getting a better battery is that there really is still not a good understanding of this chemistry experiment. The technology is poorly understood, although it's implemented, of course, and it's been around for at least 100 years for the lead acid and others. But just changing one part of a given recipe can still be a major challenge. So even if you put in a new electrode, you could have a lot of unseen developments that you can't control that lead to problems. And many of these, and this is the crux, cannot be detected until after years of testing. So like a solar panel has to last 30 years. If you have a new idea and it works for 30 days, does that mean you're there? No. So same thing for a battery. You know, you can get it and you can have it work. And in fact, I give an example here. I call it the sad story of Envia, where they had, or sort of have, a lithium battery that purportedly would give a car 3 times the range, so 300 kilometers, as opposed to 100 or so, at about half the cost. So roughly an order of magnitude improvement. And what they had to do, though, to get this kind of dramatic improvement was change 2 things. But unfortunately, it didn't work. That's what I was afraid of. I talk too much. So the point being is it didn't work. They tried to go too fast in something that's too complex. Is there an opportunity here? Is there a profit to be made? There is. So battery market has relatively small margins, okay, 5%. That may not get those of us that have been, I've been in the semiconductor industry where margins of 40% are, you know, kind of required. But it is better than SunPower's margin of minus 25%. Right, Paula? So that said, there is opportunity there. Markets are there, and I'm just giving you a couple examples. EV sales. In this chart, there's the big one shows our forecast for what EVs are going to look like going to, you know, multiple millions in about a decade. What I did in that little insert, you can probably just see it. The blue was the forecast in 2015 up to 2020. The red is the revised forecast of 2016 for the same time period. So now you have to have a forecast of the forecasts. Anyway, I thought that was kind of fun. That's the scientist in me. So microgrids too, that's some of our projections that, you know, in the next couple decades, we're going to get to substantial fractions of a terawatt. And that's based with a lot of it using storage to it. And the market's going to be in the fractions of $1 trillion by 2030. So definitely you have a lot there. You have a drop in battery prices. What this shows is that learning curve for PV, which is the price on the vertical axis with the cumulative installed on the horizontal axis. Some of this data is courtesy Paula Mentz, thank you. And on the other side, or the right side, is some of our data that we've done a similar thing for the lithium-ion battery. There's a learning curve there. And what we did in this report that I mentioned is we did something very similar for lithium-ion battery. And I don't have the time to walk you through it here, but we saw similar behavior through the different families of lithium batteries. And that's one thing that I have to emphasize over and over, that a battery is not a battery is not a battery. It depends on the application, it depends on the chemistry, it depends on the so on and so forth. So what we were able to do though here is develop a quantitative forecast to what the cost and learning curve would look like. And actually that's where the science goes and the equations are. So basically we do see a legitimate learning curve that gets you there. So making batteries, chemistry or Cauldron? It really is a good question because, and if you look at that quote in the lower bottom, battery researchers are publishing papers that show how trace amounts of additives change the behavior of the materials. I mean, you know, what can you say when you start having that kind of challenge to your engineering program? And sort of keeping the Halloween theme here, there's, from our report, there's 4 spider charts there, 4 different kinds of lithium-ion batteries, and one of the axes is safety, and Ian's going to be talking about that. It's an extremely important axis. And the other axes are some of the things that we know about: energy density, cost, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of, oops, let me go back. That's kind of the challenge. I mean, the tsunami is on the way. Do I have a minute? I'm done? Okay. It won't be easy, and it won't be fast. And it's going to need the chemists, the physicists, and the engineers. And that's where those letters on the 3 hats are coming from. You've got the chemist, the physicist, and the engineer. So there's physics humor for you. Now I'm off the hook. Okay. So that's it. That's it for me.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to set my timer here. I have 10 minutes, right? Right. Thank you for having me here, David and Brian, for inviting me. I guess you can't tell from the bio that this is kind of interesting being in the TI auditorium. The first job that I had a choice of going between TI and Bell Labs. And I ended up going to Bell Labs as a chip designer a long time ago in Pennsylvania. And so what I'm doing now is very, very different, very far from that activity. So what I'll talk about today is really storage from a policy and business perspective in terms of what's happening as far as deploying storage for power grid applications specifically. So for the longest time, energy storage in the grid has been considered the holy grail. In fact, about 2 days ago, our Secretary of Department of Energy also called it the holy grail. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but anyway, so I prefer to call it the missing link. It's the missing link to enable our transition to a carbon-free future. I think all of you should know that we need to make that happen by 2050. So that's about 33 years, so we don't have much time left to make this happen. So it's a missing link because, as you know, renewables have some challenges in terms of being stable. And so energy storage can help stabilize renewables and give us some steady output. But there are lots of other applications of storage that I will talk about. So I started studying energy storage at this regulatory agency called California Public Utilities Commission. I don't know if you've heard of that. That's an agency that overlooks the California investor-owned utilities. There are 3 big ones, PG&E, the utility serving this area, and there's one down in Los Angeles, Southern California Edison. Although it doesn't serve Los Angeles, it serves all the other towns around Los Angeles. And then there's San Diego Gas and Electric. So between the 3 utilities, they cover about 2/3 of California in terms of consumption, and that's where CPUC regulates. So around 2009, I was getting interested in energy storage, and I found that in the policy realm at least, I was the only one interested in energy storage. So there was a lot of education going on. I was talking to the utility folks, regulators, anybody that I could talk to. And of course, when you talk to the utilities, it's too expensive, it's a science fiction, it will never happen, et cetera, et cetera. And anyway, so we spent a couple of years at the commission studying all aspects of storage. We did cost effectiveness studies. We looked at different pilots that were being going on at the time. And then some other forces started to kind of come together. Jerry Brown, our governor, became a governor, and he was supportive of energy storage ideas. Same thing in Sacramento. There were a couple of legislators that were also very supportive of the idea of energy storage. And so at some point at the commission, we decided to fill the missing link by simply issuing a mandate to the utilities to go buy 1,300 megawatts of storage by 2020. So there was a lot of chicken egg issues going on. It's too expensive. We don't have enough experience. We don't know how to use it, et cetera, et cetera. So we just said, go ahead, just make things happen by forcing the utilities to buy 1,300 megawatts by 2020. And so that target was broken down into specific numbers for each of the 3 utilities. It's about 40% for the 2 larger ones, and about 15% for San Diego being the smallest one. And surprisingly, things have been going pretty well in terms of actual procurement and deployment, to the surprise of many, including people at the utilities. So at this point, we're only 4 years into the actual field experience since the mandate was issued, and the utilities have in total already contracted about 55% of the target, and there's another 200 megawatts about to be announced in the next 2 weeks by December 1 by the 3 utilities. So it will be interesting to see who won those contracts. So I think a lot of the people in the industry would credit this mandate as getting things rolling in terms of getting the industry started in terms of utilizing storage for grid application, stationary storage as opposed to mobile. And since then, you saw some charts about price decline, and prices have really been coming down very rapidly. The kind of numbers that I was projecting back in 2012 for 2020, we already bypassed those numbers last year. So that's how rapidly costs are coming down. And they're, will go down even more rapidly. Now, people used to think that, the battery costs will not come down like solar costs will come down or have come down because of this Silicon Moore's law. But as Andy showed, they are actually following some learning curve trajectory, something on the order of 15% for every doubling of the volume. And along with this price declines, the actual storage deployment has been growing exponentially. Current projections are around 60 gigawatts by 2025, another 7 years from now. I actually think these numbers are on the low end, and we'll end up revising them substantially by a couple of factors. So a bit about some of the applications that are driving the actual deployment. So renewables integration is obviously is the application most people think of in terms of energy storage on the grid, but that is actually not the application that's driving deployment right now in the near term. In the longer term, yes, but in the near term, the applications that are driving, at least in California and US, is really grid efficiency, or what I would call peak offset, which is basically using storage to charge up when demand is low, and then releasing that energy when demand is high to reduce, from the grid perspective, the effective demand peak on the grid. Another application from a utilities perspective is reliability. And why is storage interesting for reliability? So power grid, as you know, is really what I would call an unstable equilibrium. You have a slight disturbance, and the system goes away from stability. And with storage, you can turn that into a stable equilibrium, right? More disturbance, and the system will return to stability. And another application is resiliency, which is different from reliability. So the point of reliability is to avoid a power outage, and resiliency is once you have a power outage, how do you come back up? And so there you have, batteries combined with solar or wind to keep the on-premise load going while the grid is still out. And then other applications like demand-side flexibility. Diesel displacements is really big on islands. Islands have been traditionally very dependent on expensive fuels like petroleum and imported diesel. And so for them, it has been extremely economical to combine storage with solar and wind, and just basically reducing the consumption of fossil fuels on the island. And the last application noteworthy is distributed energy access. There are about 20% of the global population still has no access to grid electricity. And so a lot of emerging economies, it makes sense for them to develop solar plus battery microgrids. It's quite economical now, instead of trying to wait for the big grid to eventually come to these remote communities. Let's talk about the cost implications of deploying storage. People think, there's an impression that it might be quite expensive. So I just want to do some back of the envelope calculation. So the US annual demand peak is about a terawatt, 1,000 gigawatts. If you do 10% or 20% storage, using prices that are predicted for 2022, 5 years from now, 20% would be basically $200 billion. At 20% of the demand peak being storage, that's a hefty amount of storage. Then you have quite a stable system. You could integrate quite a few renewables at that level. And now, the question is that really expensive? And I would say not when you compare that to the cost to the economy on an annual basis from all the power outages, surges, and spikes, which is estimated to be around $150 billion. So that's just 1 year, and we could use that to get about 20% of the US peak in terms of storage. Another source of storage that we need to think about is really mobile storage, as in electrification of transportation. So the Chevy Bolt carries around a battery of 60 kilowatt hours, and California right now is selling about 2 million cars. Now, as you know, Jerry Brown has set a target. We need to get all of that electrified. And so 2 million cars, about half of them assume they're available to the grid in the form of storage. That really amounts to about 15 gigawatts of 4-hour storage. That's 30% of California demand peak. If you look at the entire fleet of cars in California, it's 25 million cars. Let's assume half of them are available to the grid. Remember, most cars on average are only moving 5% of the time. 95% of the time they're stationary. So at some point we'll think of creative ideas as to how to utilize that storage. So anyway, so 50% of California fleet translates to about 188 gigawatts. That's 20% of the US peak. This is California fleet only, not talking about electrifying the rest of the country. So, so in terms of just looking forward, I mean, at this point, I think there aren't any major obstacles remaining in terms of deploying storage across the world. I do think that, well, so far most of the deployment actually been lithium-ion batteries. 95% of storage procurement has really been about lithium-ion. But we do need to develop some of these other non-chemical storage technologies, as in thermal and hydro and mechanical and renewable gas, in order to address really large-scale renewable integration. We do need to integrate storage into resource planning across the board, as opposed to treating it as an afterthought where you deploy transmission lines first and natural gas plants first, and then you think about storage. It needs to be the other way around. See what you can do with storage first and then accommodate these other resources. Adapting policies to leverage the storage capabilities. So displacing natural gas power plants is a big opportunity at this point. Batteries plus renewables, if you do the math, is cost competitive, I would argue, at this point, with putting up a natural gas peaker plant. And we have about 120 gigawatts of peaker plants that need to be eventually replaced in the next 20 years. And hopefully every single one of them eventually gets replaced with a battery and solar, as opposed to more natural gas. And of course, there's opportunity here for high penetration of small-scale distributed energy resources instead of large-scale transmission-centric resources. And then the holy grail here, this is the true holy grail, is to evolve to a 100% renewable scenario economy-wide, which is what we need to make happen by 2050 in order to meet our 2% centigrade targets. I'll stop here, Brian.
Okay. How's everyone doing? Hi, my name is Ian Petrie. I'm with the FAA's Office of Hazardous Materials Safety, out here to promote lithium battery safety. Next slide. There you go. And I'm going to go over some key points here. Our organization and mission, Packing Instruction 965, which is going to be the most applicable to backup energy storage. PHMSA special permits, UN Working Paper 48, and lithium battery cargo incidents. And the Office of Hazardous Materials Safety really is out there to ensure and promote hazardous material safety in air commerce. And we do that through regulatory oversight, risk-based decision-making. We sit on international panels, perform outreach like I'm doing today, safety promotion, and interdisciplinary panels to develop regulatory standards. We perform research and oversight of the decision-making process. And I'm just going to briefly go over this, but this is our really confusing org chart. And basically those branches down at the bottom, there's about 10 inspection groups throughout the country, and they're assigned to geographic areas based on risk. And we're really short-staffed, so our agency figured that that's the best way to ensure safety with limited resources. So there's about 10 inspectors assigned to 10 different managers at the bottom. And this is UN Packing Instruction 965, Section 1A, and this is probably going to be the most applicable to backup energy storage, as you can see, because most of them are going to be most backup storage is going to be over 100 watt hours. It's forbidden on passenger aircraft, and I would say most backup storage batteries will even be brushing up against that 35 kilogram limitation. And that's where special permits come in, which I'm going to talk about next. And they require a shipper's declaration, basic hazard communication. They have to be shipped in UN spec packaging at the packing group 2 level and can't be shipped at a state of charge greater than 30%. This is what a compliant package would look like. And that box there could be different variations of the box as long as it's in the UN spec packaging, which is right there. That's the packing group 2 level packaging. That hazard communication, that's the shipper's declaration. It's very important because it lets the pilots of the aircraft know that they have hazardous materials on board and what hold that they're in case they need to put some halon out. And special permits are basically variances, and they let you do something that's not otherwise permitted in the hazardous materials regulations. So maybe to exceed that 35 kilogram limitation. They provide safe alternatives to the hazardous material regulations if you can provide an equivalent level of safety. Tesla has these for their home batteries. And another entity can apply for party status to a special permit if you can comply with the terms and conditions of the special permit. And I have it in bold that the hazardous materials employee must ensure that their employees receive training. That's often overlooked because there are a lot of intricacies within these permits, and they do expire. And this is the information on how to apply. I'll make the slides available to everyone, and if you have any questions too, my contact information is in the presentation. So if you do apply for a special permit, there's a process you go through, and we'll go out and perform a fitness inspection to make sure that you can comply with the terms of the special permit. And that just goes with processes and procedures, testing equipment. We look at manufacturing equipment, what type of packaging that you're using. 2-year shipper's declarations, it gives us an idea of how much you're shipping, that's a requirement. Closure instructions for the packaging you're using. United Nations 38.3 testing, that's very important. And then dangerous goods working panel, this is the UN paper 48, and this was really born out of a lot of the natural disasters that have been happening in the last 2 years, of course. You know, in disaster areas, backup energy storage is needed, it's important, and it has to get there quickly. So it kind of provides an alternative. There will be no quantity limitation, there's a proposed change for new UN number for batteries installed in a cargo transport unit. And it's due to the no quantity limitation is due to the size potential of the backup energy storage batteries. And this is what it would look like in the regulations. Lithium battery, the proper shipping name would be lithium batteries installed in the cargo transport unit. And as you can see, there's a special provision there for the size requirement. And the safety concerns really is that they're high risk because aircraft fire suppression systems, or the fires can't be mitigated by aircraft fire suppression systems. And the chemistry is always evolving and changing, the technology is changing. So it's pretty hard, regulations don't move that fast, so it's kind of hard to keep up with the technology. So those are some of the current challenges. And this is a little bit old, but this is the last time this was published. As of May 22nd, 2017, there have been 160 airport-related incidents involving lithium batteries, and this is publicly available information. If you want to Google it, you can actually look at the incident summaries. And this is an incident that happened out of the Denver airport. Yeah, he had some rechargeable AA batteries in his suitcase, and so what surprised me is how long that it took for him to realize that the suitcase was on fire, but that's kind of what we're dealing with on a pretty regular basis. So it's good to make people aware. And this was an incident that happened in 2006 on a flight from Atlanta to Philadelphia. There were laptops and rechargeable lithium-ion batteries in containers 12, 13, and 14. And the NTSB concluded that the likely cause was lithium batteries, likely cause of the incident. And they were able to land the plane, but the aircraft was a complete loss. The flight crew got off safely. And this one, they weren't so lucky. This was UPS Flight 6, and it was flying from Dubai to Cologne, Germany. And the flight crew declared an in-flight emergency, I think 45 minutes into the flight, and it crashed. There were, I think, 81,000 lithium batteries, and in this area of the aircraft, and they completely lost control. This was the initial contact point, the accident site, the debris field, and luckily it missed that military installation because it would have killed a lot of people. And this is just some of the batteries that were recovered in the investigation. And this was an Asiana cargo flight, Flight 991. It was carrying 880 pounds of lithium batteries and flew from South Korea to Shanghai, and it went down right outside of Jeju Island. And they suspect that the cause of this accident was also lithium batteries. And it was one of the reasons it was so hot that as you can see there, it burned right through the skin panel of the aircraft. And so there's a summary, and there's my contact information too. If you have any questions or you want to know anything more about special permits or what you have to do to apply for them, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to ask our three panelists to please come up here.
Okay, well, let's see. What I think we could do is take a few questions and then have some discussions that I think some of these talks have brought up, at least in my mind. So let's start with the questions. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you for taking the question. I have several, but I guess I should ask one, and then
yes.
Later on I'll try to. Anyway, question number one is, so far, what does military people use for their batteries? For example, like a submarine. Well, I understand that the U.S. submarines are all nuclear powered. But there are plenty of military submarines are powered by diesel engine and batteries. So why we never heard of batteries burn through the skins of the submarine?
Well, that's actually a good question for all three of us, because the answer is really that you have this n-dimensional space for batteries. Depending on what you're trying to optimize, takes you to different chemistries. And so, in EVs, you want high energy density and also sustained energy. You also want it to be light and affordable. So those are three major axes that you're trying to optimize. For submarines, it's a different story. So there's a whole segment of marine batteries. And I know they've used, let's see, well, do you know offhand? I don't know exactly what they are in boats, but I know that there's a lot of lead acid in surface boats. Submarines, I don't know. I guess none of us know. Do you know?
Well, I know the Navy's using some as they have some solar on some of the Navy ships, and they're using lithium ion as backup storage batteries for their solar systems.
Okay.
On some of the Navy ships, I do know that.
That's on top, right?
On top, yeah.
Not submarine.
Yeah.
And separate from the field applications, I guess. The other thing I just want to mention is the DoD has a very big initiative to transition all the bases to a much higher look.
Are you on green? Here we go.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So the DoD has a huge initiative to transition all their bases to renewable power as much as possible. In fact, I think they have a target of 50%. I forget for which year. And so at least all the bases in the U.S., you will see doing a lot of leading edge work in integrating renewables with on-site storage. And often that storage is a variety of different chemistries, lithium ion, flow batteries, flywheels, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the extent of what I can say about that.
Okay, yeah, back in the back.
Yes, I was wondering why you made no mention of the startup, which was formerly known as Liquid Metal Battery. All three of you.
Well, Yeah, I didn't get a chance to say which my favorites are. I mean, there really are dozens and dozens, and that's not counting even the fact that they get name changes and what have you. That one I don't know about, so maybe you could tell a little bit more.
So
and then I'll go into my top three.
The key thing is Professor Sadoway from MIT basically said, you can't carpet bomb the periodic table looking for chemistry. And we're not quite there where we can do computational material design, although we're getting very close. You guys should neighbor with the NVIDIA people. They think they got some people who can do some stuff. But the thing that he was pointing out is that if you want to do storage at a grid level, you don't want to have going after a scarce material like lithium, and you don't want to have an expensive chemistry. If you don't need to pay for lightweight, then you want to use much heavier atoms, which are okay in a grid storage environment, right? Because we're just putting it on the ground, right? Don't have to move it. So,
in fact, there's terminology which is mobile storage versus stationary. So, I mean, that's recognized, but yeah.
So the thing that what I expected to hear is, some story about how mobile has improved, yay. But also more about how stationary has improved, because that's what I figured. Most things don't move, right? The house doesn't move. Office buildings don't move. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't move in the world. And it's a special case, the liquid metal battery is a special case of the flow battery, which is sort of ideally suited for stationary purposes.
Okay. So one of the charts I didn't have time to go into that comes from our report shows, in fact, the learning trend for the consumer lithium, and then it has the EV and also the stationary. So the point that we utilized was that learning rate is about the same for those different applications of lithium, even though they're very much different animals. They're not, lithium ion, lithium atom, sure, that's the same. That's almost where the commonality ends. And as you indicate, whether it's stationary, mobile, or small form factor, that's going to determine which axes you go out on with the chemistries. So there is some cross-learning, but that learning rate looks like it's roughly the same. And that's a very fascinating aspect to this. And my sense of it is because you really are out on the different axes. So you can't utilize all that learning that happened against one of the other axes that was used. Does that make sense? So, and by the way, the liquid metal, that sounds great. I don't know anything about it, but I'm happy to learn.
So some marketing person decided that the liquid metal battery, which is a very clear branding statement, right, needed to be replaced with something that almost nobody knows why it's related to batteries. So I think it's like aquarium or some other, it starts with an A, but I can't remember the name because it has almost no memory for me, right? It has no conte.
What I like to say is the easiest way to think that you have Alzheimer's is try to remember battery companies from one day to the next. I've given up on it. So you guys, if you want to trip me up, it won't. I'll tell you, I'll do it right.
But Professor Sadoway, his name didn't change, and he's the leading light behind this. And he has several YouTube videos. That's how I found about it. And Bill Gates is an investor, so it's not a guarantee, but it sort of says maybe a little more chance here.
And GM invested in the NVIDIA. So sure, Bill Gates, he puts his money in sometimes where things are great, but other times it's still a gamble. I don't know anything about the liquid metal, but it looks like it sounds interesting.
Okay.
Better than sweat.
So mine is kind of a long-term question. So today, we generate 10 gigawatts in California of solar, and we use roughly, at a low point, maybe 26 gigawatts and peaks up to 37, 42 gigawatts. So at times you depress the generation so you're only generating 15 gigawatts. So, but a lot of people talk about spinning storage. You got battery storage, which you guys have been focusing on. You have obviously water and gas type storages. In 15 years, what's your estimation of which storage is going to take off? Is it going to be batteries? Is it going to be spinning? Because there are a lot of companies a few companies out there that are doing pretty well on short-term spinning, like flywheel.
By spinning, you mean?
Flywheel.
Oh, flywheel, okay.
Or is it going to, I don't see compressed gas, and I don't know about the other conversions of gas. So make your estimates on what's going to happen in 15 years. Or are there going to be all of these existing?
Well, yeah, I think my answer is along the lines of all of the above. I mean, there's so many different applications. They're all going to have different performance and cost trade-offs. So chemical batteries are certainly one space, but I think there's a huge opportunity for thermal storage, because it's very hard to do gigawatt hours of storage unless it's in the form of thermal storage, whether that's storing in gravel, thermal storage, thermal, right. I mean, that could be water-based, or it could be underground thermal storage. I think there's a huge opportunity for that.
Yeah, I would definitely say that. I mean, there's no, you saw that map of the demand space. There's no way one thing could do it. And even that box that says batteries, that's sort of it's an umbrella, because as I hope I've given you an indication, I mean, that just like, it doesn't even have a periodic chart. It's just, thousands of implementations of it. So is lithium ion going to be the quote unquote winner? I think it's a good candidate to understand the dynamics. And so that's why we focused on lithium for the report, because it shows how things could go. My own sense is that lithium has its strengths, but it also has some issues, as I think we'll hear more about. So personally, I wouldn't be surprised that lithium is supplanted. Now, that said, it might be a second generation of it. It might be some other version of it. It's kind of like, it definitely has the implementation momentum, but that doesn't give it the only rights. It just gives it like, first adopter kind of status. So that's what I would say. I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts about, the safety of lithium is kind of brushed under the rug in a lot of ways. And I think you're at where the rubber meets the road, where it really does matter.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it comes down to just how they're manufactured. From what I understand, they have to be manufactured in a very sterile environment. I mean, that's what happened with the Samsung batteries that we all heard about. I guess there was too much humidity introduced into the manufacturing process, and that's what caused those to be defective. We're seeing a lot of incidents happen with like counterfeit batteries coming over from China.
And that sort of reaffirms that sensitivity to trace elements. I mean, right. I hadn't heard that. Yeah, but I'm not surprised. So it's the way I look at it is lithium batteries are at like a local minimum in terms of their stability, but there could be an absolute minimum that they fall to and release energy in doing it and basically explode. So, it's still a chemistry experiment. The trouble is it now has real world ramifications.
I guess one thing to keep in mind, there is a huge sector that needs to be electrified, and that's transportation. So clearly that's going to drive high density batteries. So that demand, that space is going to be there, so batteries are going to be there. And because that's going to drive cost curves and learning curves and all of that, some of that battery will continue to also go into stationary applications. But I think the stationary market itself has room for all kinds of other storage applications, storage technologies.
So is there a difference in the safety for the batteries too? It seems like the lithium cobalt are the ones that catch on fire, and the lithium ferrite ones seem to be safe, and you never hear stories, or am I wrong? Like all the failures that happened in the aircraft, were they all lithium cobalt type of batteries?
No, they're varying technologies.
Okay.
Yeah, and I indicated that very quickly, again, those spider charts I showed you, or radar charts. One of the axes there was safety, and that does move in and out, depending on those were 4 lithium versions. So, that's a substantial trade-off for that, even just that family.
Where do you guys see U.S. manufacturing fit into this battery growth?
Boy, that's a loaded question.
Yes, it is.
So China can do things because the labor's subsidized, everything's subsidized, and the government throws money at it. That's why Boston Power, that had, $100 million investment, went to China, I suspect. so that they could take advantage of that opportunity and not have to try and compete head-on with Tesla here in the States. The technology expertise here is still orders of magnitude higher. And so that, I think, is the real opportunity. The manufacturing, which is what I think you're talking about, it's subsidized over there. I mean, solar, they own solar, Paula, you know? So what is it, 2/3? Yeah, 63? 53, oh, okay. So it's not quite as bad as I thought. Well, I said 2/3, but okay, it's half. So we're 1%. There you go. So if anybody would know, Paula would know. So there's your example. 1% of panels are manufactured in the US, 53 are in China. And batteries, if it's going to be a materials, labor, equipment intensive thing, it's going to be in China. Any other thoughts?
Clearly China supports their industries. I think that the problem here, we clearly have an opportunity to do a lot of manufacturing in the U.S., but the problem is our own self-made problems. I mean, we can't seem to agree on what the right thing to do is from a policy perspective. So we have a whole body of people that are still denying the science. So until we get past that, we may have some issues.
We also have no way to compete with below-cost pricing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it just is as something as simple as environmental costs. I mean, there's a reason that we paid them here is because we want to drink decent water, breathe decent air. In this town of Xi'an, which is southwest of Beijing, where they have some semiconductor manufacturing and stuff, sometimes the air is so bad it kind of rains out white powder. And I don't know how many of you have been to Beijing in the last, actually it's improved in the last 10 years, but I was there during the Olympics and there were no clouds in the sky and the sun would rise and the only way you'd know was part of the sky was a little bit brighter. Now, I don't want to put it down, but the point I'm making here is simply that the real costs are not folded into the manufacturing costs because of things like that. Now, there's substantial improvements that happen, but that statement still holds. So, when you're trying to do manufacturing and compete against that, there's just no way the U.S. is going to be able to without, polluting and everything else.
We're talking about the air pollution. Yesterday, there was a health emergency declared in New Delhi, where the air quality index was 1,000. The index is designed to go to 100. 300 is unsafe. It was made 1,000.
That's right. It made YouTube that they were having collisions on the roads because you couldn't see from the pollution.
Absolutely.
Right.
A question back here. Harking to one of the earlier questions, I'm talking about desalination, and as a byproduct, there is this heavy concentration, brine. It's so high in concentration that even brine shrimp can't survive. But I understand you can use that as an electrolyte. So if you have acres and acres of high salt concentration brine, is there something that can be done to generate energy and store it?
Are there any chemists in the audience? I'm a physicist, so sorry, I can't handle that one. No?
I was just curious.
I'm a Brian, but that's about all I can add.
You're a Brian, there you go.
Anyway, I have a second question, that's to Alok. Some of the numbers you were showing in terms of storage and where California and US in general needs to be, does that consider the Uberization part, like the home energy storage? Does that factor into that, or it's only the utility scale storage?
Well, I don't think it does. I think that's why I said that this number is probably low, that the actual numbers will be much higher. One of the bullets on the last slide, I talked about distributed energy resources. So that's really going to the Uberization concept. If you look at Germany has about, 40 or 50 gigawatts of solar, which is more than 2 times what California has. And yet, almost all of Germany's solar is distributed, meaning less than 2 megawatts and smaller on the distribution grid. And in California, most of it is on the transmission side. So, they approached it differently, but my point is there's a huge opportunity in terms of distributed energy resources, smaller scale resources, and the energy storage just makes it more powerful.
Other than saying the opportunity is huge, how are you quantifying your forecast?
I couldn't hear you.
I think you're getting your numbers from Navigant, right?
Which numbers?
The forecast?
Yes.
Yeah, those are Navigant.
How is he quantifying his forecast?
Oh, well, yeah.
That was my question.
It's...
So other than giving us some really big numbers and saying that these are likely low, how are you quantifying your forecast? What are you basing it on?
Well, I don't really have a personal forecast to hang on.
Well, how are you quantifying the one that you said was too small?
Well, that's a Navigant number.
That's not an answer to my question.
Well, so I guess I'm not sure what you're asking.
My question is, you stated that this is the forecast. It came from Navigant. I used to work there, so I can insult them freely. But no, I'm kidding. No, so you said it's a Navigant number, but you've offered that number to this group and said you thought it was too small. Why? How are you quantifying it? And this is coming from more than 2 decades as a market researcher who does nothing but deal with data, has to quantify everything.
Right.
In my world, if you say something, you best be able to back it up.
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of why I feel it's too low, is because I don't think Navigant has considered, for example, how much distributed resources are possible out there. I mean, they're not really looking at what's possible in emerging economies. And like I said, 20% of the world doesn't even have access to electricity.
That's still not quantifying why you said that.
Well, I'm saying that's my...
I'll turn this back over to you.
Oh, well, yeah, it's an extreme challenge to put numbers on those. So, I mean, it's no surprise to rely on the people like Navigant, but they really only kind of take superficial views of where it is. And what you've indicated is really important. You know, how do you get those sort of numbers out? And that's a major challenge. So those numbers...
in the EV forecast as well. You know, you showed a big jump in 1 year. That's happening in the storage world as well. Every year the forecasts keep going up.
Right.
But the actual deployment doesn't necessarily.
The actual deployment are ahead of forecasts.
Down.
I don't think so.
Well, then you need to look at the data, real data.
Well, I mean, first quarter of this year was a record. I mean, it was a record.
General are going down.
Overall trend is going down. But maybe we can offline look at the data. I mean,
go ahead and look it up.
Well, no, there's some interesting counter trends that I think you're referring to. And one of them, for instance, because I want to give you a flavor for it, is Tesla's Powerwall. So everybody knows the story, right? That the Powerwalls are getting cheaper. If you look at their numbers, they're the opposite. So they came out with Tesla Power 1.0, and it effectively was about $350 per kilowatt hour if you take the 10 kilowatt hours in their price. And now their 2.0 is actually $100 more. $100 more a kilowatt hour from their webpage. So, and that's if you even get them. And so if you take, the price per delivery, it's dividing by 0. So, okay, I won't go that far. But the point I'm making is that literally, according to their web pages, they are now more expensive than they were 2 years ago, if you even get it. So I think the point is that there's some countervailing trends here. But overall, when you look at kind of the patterns, there is definitely a future where the things are driving towards the lower costs. But you have to be savvy about this. You can't just say things are going to get cheaper and things are going to get better. They have to be realistically getting cheaper and better. And like you pointed out, which of those lithium batteries are you talking about? The ones with the consumers, absolutely. That trend is definitely there. The one with the EVs, that one's a little bit spotty. And the one with the stationary, that's really early on. So that learning hasn't gotten it down that curve far. So yeah, that's an example of, it's not a smooth run down.
I have a question. All of these storage mechanisms require power conversion, both usually into the battery and then back out of the battery. What are you looking at in terms of like cost, power ratings, voltages that they're going to be using on large scale? Not, your Powerwall in the home is going to run 120 or 240 volts, but I'm talking about utility scale kind of stuff where you're really storing a lot of energy. What are you looking at in terms of cost per watt?
Right.
And voltages they're running, and what kind of what does that space look like?
So What we see, and that's the thing also, Will, when you start hearing about the cost reductions of batteries, they all talk about the upfront CapEx costs. That is one out of literally 11 cost elements that go into batteries. And in our report, we go into this a little bit more in detail. But you have things like, you have the fixed upfront costs, you have the running costs, you have maintenance costs, you have charging costs, which is a little bit what you're talking about. I mean, the batteries have to be charged up, and that costs money. That doesn't just happen. I mean, unless you're talking about the sweat-based battery, but okay, I'll let that go. So what you're getting at is the true refinements that go into what are the costs of a battery and how you have to go to these different focus points when you're going out on these axes that have different applications. So when you talk about that learning curve for batteries, it's really kind of it's an interesting guide, and it can be useful to a point, but you have to understand all those assumptions. And what we do in that cost analysis is we take some of the major ones that are the fixed upfront costs, but then you also have installation costs, you have the running costs, the operation and maintenance, the charging costs, the replacement costs. There's things for like what you're talking about. You have transportation costs, you have safety and recycling costs. I mean, so as I said, there's 11 categories.
Yeah, well, I was specifically asking about the power conversion portion of that.
Well, power conversion, okay, so you're talking about like voltage to voltage and what have you. Yeah, those components are going to be part of that associated hardware, which would be, in a sense, the balance of system.
I mean, from what I know, it's at least at utility scale, we're probably looking at less than 5 cents per watt now for power conversion. So it's come down very significantly. And as far as the voltage level you were asking about that, people are starting to do now 1200 or 1500 volt buses to do the conversion. So I think those were the two specifically.
So does the battery supply 1500 volts to these converters?
So I should say the 12 to 1500 is really more on the solar side yet. The batteries, I think, are still more around 800 volts, but they're starting to increase those buses as well. Right.
So, John, actually, and thank you for being the straw man audience plant for the power side of the house. Actually brings up an interesting point. We've talked a lot about batteries and the economics of it, right? And even, and I think kind of to John's point, to elaborate further, that, even the power electronics, or let's even just say in terms of batteries, the battery management system, right? It's not just the CapEx associated with that, but there's a lot that goes into that, the nuances, the topology, and to meet the requirements of individual chemistries, the state of charge, the charge rate, when you can go on a constant current, constant voltage, which will also determine the economics ultimately. So I don't know if your 11 factors, if that's something that's considered, and not just a battery management system as some electronics that hook up and enable the charging and integration, but are you actually looking into the specifics of the nuances of the battery management system, which I believe is what John is getting at, and how that actually impacts the economics directly and, with the life of the battery and all that. It's a huge factor.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And it's easy to lose sight of that because it's almost an assumption, but a battery cannot almost exist in the way we use it without a battery management system. And so that complexity definitely goes in there, and it's what keeps, I don't need to tell you guys, but so explicitly that's not broken out, but it's implicitly assumed, and some of those, the costs are just very round numbers, sort of a 10% level to have battery management systems. I mean, maybe you guys know a little bit better, but I'm just trying to give you a guidance because they're crucial. I mean, that is crucial.
Yeah, well, varies greatly, right? The sealed lead acid folks will tell you it's not necessary.
Well,
for lithium ion and some of these other advanced chemistries, undoubtedly, whether it's safety, operation, or whatever.
Yeah, kind of basically anything beyond lead acid, it's what I've seen, it's necessary.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
I have a question here. Is fundamentally, we as human beings wanted the convenience, right? That's the reason why we use the electricity, right? In the beginning, the hydropower seems to be satisfying everyone's loading needs. And then we invented the power plant burns coal and then natural gas, and Then we invented this battery that we can charge it up. And but today, let's look at, I mean, did we really hurt the environment more, or we really did a lot good to the environment? I mean, California alone doesn't count because California is such a small percentage of the entire globe, right? I mean, U.S. continent, or I mean, the other third world nation is called China, right? I mean, did we really hurt the environment more, or we helped save the environment? Not to mention that the EVs are they carrying the weight of the battery or carrying the weight of the payload, such like human body weight and groceries in the trunk?
Well, yeah. I mean, you can actually ask the question, have humans been good for the environment or not? Same question. And I think the answer is the same.
Hi. So although I could spend hours talking about batteries and physical chemistry and stuff, I also wanted to expand the discussion to include some of the things that are battery-like but not exactly batteries. So some people would call a fuel cell a gaseous flow battery, right? And I was wondering what you thought the future was in terms of biofuels and fuel cells getting together and forming battery-like functions, and how do you see that evolving over time?
Yeah, so I think fuel cells are absolutely viable. I mean, there's a car out now, of course, I'm sure you know, that's based on them. I think there's a lot of potential there. The downside from what we've looked at is that it takes very expensive materials to have a good fuel cell that's hydrogen-based. That's the only one I know of. So there's definitely a learning curve opportunity there, a technology evolution opportunity, and I think it's part of the family of energy producers. And I think I think it has a lot more opportunity. It's just further up the learning curve. And it's right now, in fact, there's a winery in Napa, Stone Ridge or something like that. Stone Ridge? Okay, yeah. That has, I've been there, I just couldn't remember the name. It's that Alzheimer's thing. They have a microgrid and they have the hydrogen fuel cell that's working quite well. And I mean, they convinced me that that's a great way to go. It's a little early. And when I asked the guy who was in charge of it, what were the high cost materials, they were the things that go into it. So do we have enough bright chemists, physicists, engineers? Yeah. Well, let's get at it. Because I think that actually is probably better in the ultimate sense than the chemistries of the lithium ion. That's my sense.
Well, so if you were to look at the ideal energy storage, you would look and you would say, God truly loves us, because if you look how awesome diesel fuel is, or Jet A, or whatever you want to call Diesel 1, kerosene, there's around that size of hydrocarbon and around that energy density if you have straight chain hydrocarbons of that weight in C12 to about C16. You can do amazing things, right? You can have a small thing and it can last you 1,000 miles and all that kind of stuff. But the problem is that how do we get from methane or hydrogen to C12, right, or C16, right, so that we have a nice cetane rating? And although it's nice to say that, I think it's part of the future and stuff, some part of your slide said we're expecting batteries to get this good by 2025 and some magic thing to happen by 2050 or something like that. And what I was really hoping you were going to say is progress in the fuel cell biofuel area is happening is that we can get 60% efficiency at your house with C16.
Well, yeah, that would be a visionary forecast. That's entirely doable, but you have to look at your assumptions. And sure, I mean, it's if an agency that had enough resources could put the monies and the minds behind it, it could accelerate where we are. There's no doubt.
So you're not familiar with the Department of the Navy work, are you?
No, are they working on it?
Yes, they are.
Okay, well.
All right, thank you.
Tell me more about it.
Can you talk a bit about the water splitting or solar fuel?
Say that again, the hydrogen fuel cell?
No, like solar fuels.
Well, my familiarity with that is for water purification and desalination. Is that what you're talking about? No. Do you know what he's asking?
Yeah, like photoelectrochemical cells. There's a DOE program through multiple labs, including Stanford and Berkeley, and they're trying to do direct separation of hydrogen and oxygen, photoelectrode.
Right.
Strontium titanate and these kinds of things.
Right, and then once you recombine them, then you get the energy out. Right, so you use like photons to separate, and then you recombine. Myself am not overly familiar with it, other than that's a general concept. I don't know where it's at. Do you know? Okay, I mean, yeah.
In the power sector.
The round trip efficiency of a normal ionizer and fuel cell combination is in the 42% range. If you bust a gut and you do things in a pristine lab, you can get it up to 51%, but that's really hard to replicate someplace. So the nice thing about the strontium titanate is that they can improve the round trip efficiency by another 20%. Okay? But they don't have wide deployment. But they have some very nice science projects.
So what do you think is holding it back?
Well, so what? No. Let me talk. If I'm going to screw it up, I want to screw it up myself. So the basic problem is that when you go things to scale, it goes from chemistry to chemical engineering, which means all of those little trace elements that you said I don't have to think about because I have, metallurgical, chemical, Nobel Prize winning chemical suppliers. I now have to deal with mixing vats that are now huge, that get contaminants from the air and all this kind of stuff, which is part of the problem with Tesla's building a factory in Reno because, they got weed and ragweed and a whole bunch of things they do not have in Japan. And the photocatalyzed is actually running, it takes photons, but it also runs the cell in reverse, right? So it gets two energy sources, right? And getting that to work consistently is the problem, right?
Yeah, so that's a familiar story and one that I've had in my experience, which is what I call, and it's probably a typical expression, lab to fab. And, so like you can make a thumbnail size solar cell that gives you 25% efficiency. Then you try to get that out of something this size, you're getting 20. You try to get it out of something like this size, you're at 16. So it's a familiar issue that scaling, ramping, converting, you have to be aware that control that you had for that thumbnail no longer exists. Either the specs aren't there or it's a larger area. Applied Materials tried to make a solar panel that was the size of like that door, pretty much. The issue was, it would work for a 1 by 1 meter, but not a 3 by 3 meter because you've got to have uniformity and you've got to have deposition control. And as an engineer, you could appreciate that, you won't necessarily have a 0.1% uniformity across a 2 meter run. So it's not, concept-wise, it's not a big deal. It just, you have to get that engineering crank to turn and see if you could ultimately get there. So I think that's where they're at, right?
All right, hold on. Let's pull this back up a level, too, just so we'll get out of the lab for a second and make sure we're getting into some grid-level energy storage. Sir.
So here's my question to all of you. There's a couple of highly visible battery projects, speaking of Tesla. One is the solar plus storage in Puerto Rico. and the other is in South Australia, 100 megawatt, I think it's 120 megawatt hour system that Elon Musk says that he's going to put in by December, or it's free. And so maybe each of you can comment on what you know about those two, or maybe what you don't know.
If you turn the cameras off for a second, I'll give you my
Okay. And I'm particularly thinking that maybe there's something about...
He's got more money than I do. I don't want him to go after me.
I'm wondering about how they transported that to these two locations, what the issues might be, and 100 megawatt or 120 megawatt hours worth of batteries in Australia, and also this highly visible Puerto Rican hospital with solar plus storage, both Tesla. So
actually, you could hand the microphone over to Paula. She might have a few thoughts on the matter. But
just an interruption. Kevin, operating the camera, says he can edit out any comments. So feel free to say what you want. He can edit that out.
Don't worry, I told him. Okay. We're good.
Well, Tesla, it's a Panasonic battery, first of all. So the odds of him, it's going to be a free system in Australia, I promise you. There's just not the capacity. There's not the production capacity. It's not going to happen. In Puerto Rico, you're going to see a little of it, but he sent letters to all of the installers who ordered Powerwalls and told them they would not be receiving them. So it's not like he has an unlimited capacity. So that's one thing we haven't talked about, is and that is, I'm sorry for picking on you for Navigant's forecast, but as an analyst, never present a forecast you can't explain. You just you look silly. Don't edit it out.
All right, come on, let's move on.
But aside from that, the point is you have to have the capacity. So when I study an industry, it's from it's raw material, machinery, all the way through. There's not the capacity to do the stuff that he's promised. And if you take a look at his cars, I'm just going to pick on Tesla. He slips. When he starts slipping in my industry, which is solar, watch out, dude. He doesn't have the capacity. He's not manufacturing him anyway. It's Panasonic. There you go.
All right, but so let's not make sure too that we're focused on this is not about Elon Musk solving the world's problems, right? And then also let's also remember that the high level thing here is energy storage, not even necessarily just batteries. We've touched on some other energy storage areas, right? We've touched on the economic impact. So especially in a world where we're talking about, say, dynamic power markets, and maybe something that's going to move towards prices that are changing on 5-minute scales instead of 30-minute scales. Now how much does this become far more of an economic argument analysis than a storage element one, an energy one, or meeting a demand analysis?
Well, yeah, when you open it up to storage of any form, there's just so many. And again, in our report, one of the things we do is actually make the comparison in LCOE across these different platforms, if it's hydro versus compressed air versus lithium battery. And they have a range. They have just a massive range in terms of what they're going to do and how they're going to perform under different demand cycles. To try to put them together, it's kind of impossible because there's everything from spinning, who somebody mentioned, or flywheels, up to hydro. And you can compare them at some level when you start talking LCOE for their application, but after that it starts getting tricky to make comparisons. There was one that I want to mention because I found this particularly fascinating. Using, and maybe you guys have heard of this, but using potential energy of gravity as storage. So had you heard about it? They have these trains, and it's where? Paso Robles? Where?
Southern California.
Oh, okay, the Rockies. That wouldn't surprise me. So the sun generates electricity that moves the train up during the day, and then it comes down at night and produces.
They're loaded with rocks, so it's slow moving, very heavy weights.
Right.
So the trains are heavier than water, which is why they can have a large amount of energy in a small amount of space.
Right.
Right?
So Colorado has a water shortage, generally speaking, and this is a great way to not have water in the creek and still be able to get the advantage of gravity feed.
Okay, yeah, so there's a company, though, I think it's in Central California, that's been working on this when I talked to them. But they may be in the Rockies too, which would make sense.
So the site is in the Rockies, the design team is in California.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's
an example of my bullet mechanical.
Right, mechanical, right. Yeah, so there is some of that.
Yes.
I don't know how niche that is. Certainly safer.
Safe.
Unless you're in the tracks, although if it's rolling down slowly, sure.
So I guess do I have time for a question or not? Are we done?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, pulling back to utility scale grid, a lot of stuff in the utilities meant the last 30, 40, 50 years, and a lot of the energy storage is not, but people are. So what types of storage are, on those, there were 1.3 gigawatt worth of bids that went out through STG, Con Edison, and I think the northern one here, PG&E. So was there a requirement of 20 to 30 or 40 years of in their specs that went out?
What's the question?
Requirements were, at least for the PV, yeah. So
for the storage, for the utility
storage, right.
storage.
So were the requirements that it had 30-year lifetime? I doubt it.
Most of these are 20-year power purchase agreements.
20 years.
20 years.
But if you have a flow battery, I think, what I've understood from them is that flow batteries are good for at least 10 years, and then another 10 years, it's no big deal. That's...
Yeah, I was at a flow battery company before, so we were advertising 20 years.
Yeah, right.
One refresh around 10 years.
Refresh at 10, yep, right.
Refresh meaning basically changing the stacks.
Okay.
But the chemistry was fine.
So, see, that's an example of just where he was at, where you have a flow battery, that 20 years is no big deal. But it's a flow battery.
But the lithium-ion projects that the utilities are contracting right now, they all assume that the batteries will be replaced at some rate to make the 20-year commitment. That's built into the cost.
As we're approaching the close here, I'd like to actually, we've had this has turned into a quiz on are you aware of battery startups and chemistries, which is interesting, but are you aware of regulations? And this is what I'm curious to hear from Ian's perspective is, whether there's existing energy storage, all these emerging, whether it's, chemistry-based or otherwise. How is the government prepared? I mean, obviously you have pretty extensive stuff now, having learned some lessons and things, say, on lithium ions and lithium variants. Mm-hmm. But how are you prepared to, if the technology in the market provides these good solutions, how are you guys going to catch up in terms of ensuring their viability for safety and transport and whatnot?
As best as we can. I mean, it's really hard to keep up with all these new technologies, and obviously the regulatory world doesn't move that fast. So, I mean, I think we're on the 30-something UN meeting, so the UN convenes a couple times a year to kind of raise concerns of new technologies, etc., and to try and develop international regulatory policy.
One question regarding maybe all three of you in the panel. So have we started to quantify where we are going with energy storage in terms of per capita? And then where does U.S. stand with respect to Europe, Asia, and other countries? And I pose this in the context of next 5 years or 10 years. So where are we in per capita energy storage?
Per capita?
In terms of population, the reason I'm asking is when it comes to carbon emissions, some of the developing economies push back because they say that they consume much less per capita.
Well, yeah, I don't know that particular filter cut has been put on the analysis, other than, there's a great need in developing countries, but like India, where we've had some projects, has a huge capita, but doesn't have a lot of storage, so that number might not reflect a whole lot. I mean, you could suggest something like the growth opportunity per capita, in which case India is huge.
And the corollary to my question is, if you juxtapose that with carbon emissions, will there be any mandates going into Doha or another, round of, climate change, discussions where they'll say you need to do this amount of storage, grid level or whatever, in order to address carbon emissions too?
Well, I know at least sort of a plus and a minus is that right now for utility scale solar in America, it has to be dispatchable, which means it has to be 100% deliverable. So that means it has to have batteries to have any PPA capability. So to some extent, that's kind of forcing it a bit.
There is one professor, Stanford professor, Mark Jacobson. He has done studies for every country and proposed a portfolio of renewables and recommended amount of storage that would get that country to 100% renewable scenario economy-wide, meaning including transportation, all sectors. And he's got a website, and you can go look at that. But it's somewhat controversial, obviously.
All right, guys. I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut it off there. We do have a hard stop on having everyone out of the room at 8:30. Which does mean even if we're having post-conversations, man, you will be literally kicked out in the parking lot. So everyone, including the staff here, has to be out by 8:30. So please join me in giving our speakers and everything. Thank you all. And I'd like to individually, as a token of our appreciation, let's see, Andy, since you're closest here, present you with a certificate, and we'll do the gratuitous photo here.
Oh,
don't leave me hanging.
Okay, thank you.
All right.